The cameras were rolling. 1,000 flashes lit the air like a battlefield. And across the long marble table of the Vatican Press Hall, she leaned forward, a woman sharpened by headlines and cynicism, the kind of journalist who didn't just ask questions, she cornered people with them. She didn't come for sound bites. She came for blood. Pope Leo XIV sat still at the other end, dressed in his white cassock, his fingers loosely intertwined, his eyes, quiet, unreadable. He was not what she expected. The world saw a spiritual titan. She saw an old man hiding something. And for the next 6 minutes, her words would slice through the silence like a blade. Your Holiness, she began, measured, disarming, before the Papacy, before Rome, you spent over a decade in South America, specifically Peru. Why is that time missing from your official biography? The question hung in the air. Not because it hadn't been asked before, but because no one had dared ask it here. Not in this room. Not in front of the world. Not with a camera live streaming to 5 continents. The Vatican aide to the left shifted uncomfortably. A member of the Swiss Guard flinched. The translator stopped mid-whisper. But Leo did not move. He blinked slowly. He smiled, not the smile of charm, but of recognition. As if the storm had finally arrived, and he had already prepared the ark. The journalist, sensing the weight of the silence, pressed forward. Were you running from something? Or hiding something so dark that even the Vatican feared to touch it? Her voice was calm. But the air grew dense. Like a room holding its breath. Even the light seemed to dim. Leo leaned forward. Not with outrage. Not with denial. But with something the room hadn't expected, stillness. Unshakable stillness. And then, with the steady breath of a man who had buried children, washed open wounds, and prayed for forgotten souls under rusted rooftops. He answered. Not with defense. Not with apology. But with truth. Truth so piercing, so disarming, that no one in that room would ever forget what followed. Because what he said next, silenced the room. Before we continue, pause. And ask yourself, where are you watching this from? And more importantly, are you listening to respond, or to understand? If truth still matters to you, then lean in. If it doesn't, you'll know where to go. He had not always been called Leo. Long before the mitre, before the white robes and global reverence, he had been Mateo Alonso, born in the coastal city of Cadiz, Spain. The son of a shipyard worker and a mother who folded linens for the wealthy, Mateo grew up between salt winds and quiet prayers. He was not the loudest in his parish, nor the most gifted in seminary. But there was a stillness in him, something that listened before it spoke, something that studied pain without turning away. At 24, when most of his peers scrambled for placements in European dioceses or cushioned academic positions, Mateo chose differently. He declined the Vatican's recommendation for Rome and instead filled out a single form, requesting voluntary reassignment to the most neglected missionary post they would allow. The reply came in silence. No applause. No commendation. Just coordinates. Peru. The jungle outskirts. No electricity. No hospital. No comfort. He packed one bag. And left. He would not return to European soil for nearly 15 years. In that time, he buried children whose names no census ever recorded. He baptized addicts moments before they slipped away in mud-stained shelters. He bandaged wounds with torn cloth. He broke his own body fasting so another could eat. But what shocked the Vatican most, was not that he survived it. It was that he never spoke of it. Not once. Not in reports. Not in interviews. Not even in private letters. It was as if those years were sacred ground, too holy to dissect, too intimate to parade. Until now. Now, in a room made of polished marble and cameras, his past was being dragged into light by someone who didn't believe silence could ever be sacred. Her name was Eleanor Sharp. American. Brilliant. Polished. Known across the media world as the woman who could tear down an empire with a single interview. She had exposed presidents. Cornered CEOs. Made cabinet members cry on air. But she had never faced a man like this. To her, he was another figure of power hiding behind faith. To him, she was another voice that mistook loudness for leadership. She arrived in Rome with an entourage and an agenda. Her questions were loaded. Her tone, civil. But the emptiness behind her words betrayed something deeper, a spiritual drought dressed in designer skepticism. The Vatican had reluctantly approved the interview. Not because it trusted her, but because Pope Leo had insisted on it. And now, in this moment, with the world watching, with broadcasters in London, New York, Melbourne, and Toronto live streaming every breath, the two faced each other. She represented the skeptical modern world. He, the mystery it could not fully explain. He was the first pope chosen from the southern hemisphere. The first in decades who had not been part of Rome's internal elite. The first to emerge from a place the church itself had almost forgotten. And because of that, his silence was dangerous. To some, suspicious. To others, holy. Now, that silence was cracking. And the world leaned in. If his humility already speaks louder than your favorite politicians, subscribe. If not, explain your truth in the comments. But don't leave this moment pretending you felt nothing. The room was heavy, not with noise, but with expectation. Eleanor Sharp adjusted her blazer, her fingers brushing the rim of her notepad. The cameras were locked on her. A dozen lenses angled toward the Pope's still frame, waiting for the dance to begin. Her voice, when it came, was polished and poised. "Your Holiness," she began, with the soft insistence of someone sharpening a knife behind a smile, "many leaders, religious or not, have taken firm stances on today's global issues, climate collapse, refugee rights, armed conflict, reproductive health. You, however, have remained, remarkably silent. Why haven't you spoken out?" She didn't blink. The question was not meant to wound. Not yet. It was meant to prod. To start unraveling the mask she believed he wore. Pope Leo, unmoved, looked at her the way a candle looks at wind. There was no shift in his breath, no twitch in his jaw. "Only this, silence," he said, "is not always avoidance. Sometimes it is protection." She tilted her head. Protection for whom? He held her gaze. For the suffering. For the unseen. For the ones too fragile to survive being spoken of in debate halls and news panels. The audience stirred. Someone coughed in the back. Eleanor pressed forward, calmly. "But why disappear for over a decade in Peru? Surely the church would have benefited from your voice sooner." She said, "Disappear," as if he had gone into exile. As if living among dying villagers was a vanishing act. He gave a slight smile. The kind that made the studio light seem to dim. "Peru wasn't hiding," he said. "It was healing." There was a pause. No thunder. No applause. Just the creak of a chair. The hum of a satellite feed. She leaned back. But the war had only just begun. He had not denied the accusation. He had not defended his choices. He had simply reframed them, so deftly, so morally, that her cleverness suddenly felt juvenile. But she wasn't done. "Are you saying, then, that the work you did in Peru outweighed the influence you could have had here, on the world stage?" He nodded slowly. "I'm saying that feeding one starving child is not less important than negotiating treaties. I'm saying the world stage is often more concerned with applause than impact." A silence fell. Not the uncomfortable kind, the revealing kind. The kind that makes people aware of what they've ignored. She looked down at her notes. The line of questions had only begun. But so had the unraveling. If you've ever been judged for doing quiet good, subscribe. If you've never felt that way, tell us why in the comments. Tell the world how you've never had to defend your silence. And let's see who relates. The journalist's eyes sharpened. Her tone, once soft with measured curiosity, began to crystallize into something firmer, controlled, but undeniably confrontational. It was the shift every experienced viewer could feel. The gloves hadn't come off, but the silk had begun to slip. "Isn't your silence," she asked, her voice tightening like a noose, in itself, political? The question was louder than its tone. It was the accusation behind the curtain, that the Pope's restraint was not reverence, but strategy. That his quietness was convenient. She leaned forward. "You avoid direct comments on abortion, on global conflict, on systemic wealth. These are moral battlegrounds. Are you saying the Church no longer has a voice?" There it was. The challenge fully formed. Not framed as attack, but as indictment. The room was still. Even the audience members. Cardinals, reporters, skeptics alike, felt the axis shift. Pope Leo did not react with volume. He did not reach for theology. He reached inward. His voice was low, almost distant, not because he was evading, but because he was remembering. "There are some things," he said slowly, "that cannot be understood from behind a podium." The journalist waited. But he wasn't finished. "I have watched a 12-year-old boy bleed to death on a wooden table in the back of a Peruvian clinic. Because his father couldn't afford the $2 antibiotics a local hospital charged. I have walked 3 hours by foot to carry a woman, barefoot, torn, and barely conscious, out of a mining camp where she had been kept like property for 6 months. I have held the hand of a girl no older than 15 as she whispered her confession between contractions, on the dirt floor of a shack." He looked up. His eyes were not hard. They were exhausted. Not from weariness, but from memory. "I didn't avoid moral debates," he said. "I lived where the debate ends, and the pain begins." A breath rippled through the room. The journalist opened her mouth, but no question came out. Not yet. Because she could feel it, this wasn't strategy. This wasn't deflection. This was testimony. And testimonies, when told truthfully, have a way of shifting blame without throwing it. "I didn't hide from politics," Leo continued. "I simply didn't believe it could carry a child across a river during a flood. I didn't believe it could restore the dignity of a woman who had been sold twice before she turned 20. His voice didn't rise. It sank. And the lower it sank, the more the room leaned in. "I didn't preach from balconies. I whispered from trenches. I didn't appear in headlines. I appeared in huts." He folded his hands, and for the first time, leaned back, not in triumph, but in closure. "If that made me invisible. Perhaps invisibility was where God needed me most." No one moved. Not because they feared interrupting, but because they feared realizing how long they'd ignored this kind of leadership. The journalist looked down at her notepad. Suddenly, the bullet points didn't feel like ammunition. They felt like echoes in a room already filled with something heavier. If that kind of leadership moves you, hit subscribe. And if it doesn't, write us why, but be honest. Say it clearly. Let others hear it. And ask yourself, what kind of leader are you really hoping for? There is a sound in certain rooms, a kind of silence so dense it feels like the air itself has weight. That was the silence that filled the Vatican media hall as Pope Leo finished speaking. But Eleanor Sharp wasn't done. She had built her career on refusing to blink. Her talent wasn't just asking questions, it was waiting for the cracks, spotting the tremors beneath polished surfaces. And yet, for the first time in her career, she found herself staring not at a politician, not at a bureaucrat, but at a man who didn't flinch in the face of confrontation because he had already stood face to face with suffering. Still, she leaned in. Her voice lost its sheen. It wasn't soft anymore, it was harder now, angling toward control. "Let me ask plainly," she said, "are you the Vatican's puppet?" The question didn't echo. It landed. There was no gasp. No stir. Just that same impossible stillness. But she kept going. "Or are you afraid of taking sides, on war, on wealth, on justice? Because silence can be interpreted as cowardice." For a moment, Pope Leo said nothing. Not out of hesitation, but out of gravity. Then, slowly, as if choosing each word from a sacred place far deeper than rhetoric, he lifted his gaze and answered. "I've held starving children in my arms," he said. "I've felt their ribs beneath my fingertips. I've watched them cry without tears, because even their bodies were too dry to weep. That's not politics." His voice did not rise. It deepened. It's sacred. He looked directly at her, not to confront, but to invite. "You speak of sides," he continued, "but the child dying of hunger does not ask if his rescuer is left or right. The girl escaping violence does not check for your doctrine before accepting your hand. You want me to declare allegiance to agendas." He leaned forward, and the weight of his next words broke whatever resistance remained in the room. "But I already have. To the crucified. To the beaten. To the ones no platform wants to carry. You call it naive to protect the innocent," he said, "I call it sacred." And there it was. The moment when everything turned. Not because the Pope had won the exchange, but because he had never entered it to win at all. He came to witness. And witnessing has a way of burning through argument. Even the camera operators forgot to zoom. Even the technicians paused their feed checks. Even Eleanor, sharp, trained, relentless, found herself quiet, staring, processing. Not defeated. Just disarmed. If those words made you pause, subscribe. And if they didn't, if they passed over you like breeze over stone, scroll down and explain what didn't land. Tell the world why that kind of truth doesn't move you. We'll wait. The pause between Eleanor's question and Pope Leo's reply stretched longer than the producers liked. In television, time is currency, and silence is usually a deficit. But here, this silence was the most valuable thing in the room. And then he spoke. Not hurried. Not harsh. But as if drawing the words from a well deeper than opinion. "You confuse compassion with control," he said. The line didn't shout. It landed. "You confuse silence with cowardice. And presence with politics. You want labels, allegiances, camps. But I've lived where camps don't matter, where only food, water, and one safe night of sleep decide who lives to see another sunrise." Eleanor sat back. The rhythm of her breath had shifted, slightly shallower now. Not because she'd lost composure. But because something else had settled over her. A weight. A realization. Leo continued. "I serve no agenda. I serve suffering. Not causes. Not coalitions. Not kingdoms built by men." The camera crews remained frozen. A bead of sweat crawled down one technician's temple. A light flickered quietly in the corner. And still, no one moved. "You want statements," he said. "But I've buried children whose names were never written. I've anointed wounds with river water because there was no oil. I've said mass under a tree because no church was left standing." A low murmur rose from the back. Foreign journalists whispering translations, unsure whether they were witnessing a defense or a sermon. Leo wasn't debating anymore. He was revealing. And while institutions argued over doctrine, he said, I watched a mother wrap her dead child in a rice sack because we had no linen, and walk 6 miles to find a patch of dirt deep enough to bury her without dogs digging him up at night. The room breathed in at once, and held. I do not wear this robe to win debates, he said. I wear it to remind myself that if I do not kneel before suffering, then I have no right to stand before power. The shift was complete. Eleanor Sharp, once the unshakable interrogator, looked down at her notes not to find her next question, but because she could no longer meet his eyes. And in that moment, something passed through the room that not even the cameras could capture, a quiet awe. The kind that makes you lower your voice without knowing why. The kind that turns confrontation into confession. Not a word was spoken, yet everything had changed. If truth spoken calmly still wins, subscribe. And if not, be bold and say why in the comments. Speak up, if you can. And if you can't, ask yourself why that silence feels heavier than noise. The silence in the studio had become its own kind of sermon. There were no more interruptions. No more sharpened questions. No more clever pivots. Only eyes, watching. Only hearts, suspended. Only time, slowed to the rhythm of truth. And then, without preamble or pageantry, Pope Leo turned his head. Not to Eleanor, not to the press table, but to the camera. To the world. To us. His eyes met the lens as if it were a person, and his voice, though quiet, carried the weight of something centuries old. This is no longer about questions, he said. But about choices. A pause. Not for effect, but for reverence. We are building a world, brick by brick, he continued, with every word we speak, every kindness we extend, or withhold. Every small cruelty we normalize. Every dignity we deny. Every suffering we ignore, because it's too far, too inconvenient, too politically messy to touch. His voice held no judgment, only gravity. I have seen what happens when a child learns, too early, that they are disposable. I have seen what happens when a mother must choose which of her children eats today. And I have seen what happens when the world grows loud with opinions and deaf to pain. He closed his eyes for a breath, not from exhaustion, but from prayer. Leadership is not about declaring sides. It is about creating space. Space for the wounded. Space for the complicated. Space for the ones who have nothing left but breath. Then, lifting his head slightly, he looked again into the lens. No hint of superiority. Only a tired tenderness. We will not be remembered for our headlines, he said. We will be remembered for what we carried. And what we refused to carry. A hush deepened. He folded his hands. And with no announcement, no shift in posture, he began to bless the room. Not with incense. Not with Latin. But with something older than both, moral clarity clothed in grace. May you look at the world with slower eyes. May your judgments be delayed by compassion. May you remember that being loud is not the same as being right. And may you find that holiness often walks in silence, beside the suffering. No one applauded. Because some words are not meant to be clapped for. They are meant to be carried. If you want to build a softer world, subscribe. And if not, take the mic below. Say why. Not just for yourself, but for the kind of world you believe is worth defending. The room never quite returned to what it had been. Even as the lights dimmed, even as producers glanced at clocks and whispered cues into hidden earpieces, something sacred lingered in the air. Something that would follow everyone who had been present, long after they left the marble halls of Vatican Media Room 1. Pope Leo had returned to stillness, but it was not the stillness of retreat. It was the stillness of completion. Of having said what needed to be said, not with the force of rhetoric, but with the mercy of memory. The journalist, Eleanor Sharp, sat quieter than the world had ever seen her. She didn't rise immediately. She didn't reach for her phone. She looked. Stunned, but not wounded. Like someone who had walked into a battle and found, instead, a burial ground. And somewhere, behind every screen in every city where this broadcast reached, viewers sat still in living rooms, in dorms, in waiting rooms and airport lounges, hearing not just words, but a confrontation between two worlds, one that asks to be seen, and one that sees without being asked. So now, it turns to you. What would you have said, if you were in that room? Would you have joined the pressure to demand answers, or would you have recognized a man who had lived among ghosts and grace? Would you have dismissed his stillness, or leaned in, sensing it was forged in fire? Do you believe Pope Leo saw something in Peru, something too sacred to explain to men who've never wept in dirt beside a dying stranger? Or do you think silence is still just silence, and that no amount of service can excuse a lack of spectacle? Search your heart. Then speak. May we seek truth with humble hearts, and never forget the weight of silence. This is Circle of God's Glory. If you felt anything today, subscribe. And if you didn't, don't leave silent. Comment why. Let the world hear your honesty. Let it echo.